Okay, I think we will make a start to this webinar. Thank you to everybody who has joined. Esther, are you sharing the slides on myself? Ah, marvelous. Okay, so welcome to this webinar that is part of the British Pain Society's webinar series. As a little background to the organisation, we're one of the oldest and multidisciplinary professional organisations representing professionals working in the area of pain in the UK. And we aim to promote education, training, research and development in all aspects of pain. I realise that that is quite a large area, and I think that's an area, a topic that we may come back to during the course of this webinar today. Our membership is multi-professional and we have over 800 members, so are uniquely relevant to represent on all matters relating to pain. And we endeavour to increase both the professional and public awareness regarding prevalence of pain, but also the need for treatment and managing pain as well. Next slide, please. So we hold, in addition to these webinars, a annual scientific meeting, and this slide is showing the details of our next annual scientific meeting, which is to be held for the first time in many years in Wales in June 2025, and we look forward to welcoming as many people that are able to attend that meeting as possible. And then finally, some housekeeping. If you're familiar with Zoom, if you can try and include your questions in the Q&A box rather than the chat, but I will try and keep an eye on both, and this may be done as you go along, or we can do later as the presentations finish. The webinar is being recorded and will be available on the BPS YouTube channel fairly soon. And so if you'd like to re-listen to any sections, then that's the place to go and find it. And then finally, you will receive an evaluation form, and this will allow you to claim a certificate of attendance. And you'll receive a link for this by email in the morning. So this webinar is around promoting trustworthiness in research, in pain research, and is an area that we should all have some interest in. The number of papers that are published is immense, and it's not possible for everybody to be able to read, digest, and understand every single publication. So ensuring trustworthiness in research is extremely important. And this webinar has been designed by Professor Neil O'Connell, who is going to be our first speaker, who has led a European funded networking project that has been looking at enhancing trust in pain evidence and developing a framework in order to support that improvement, called the ENTRUST-PE network. And he is going to, first of all, introduce that the framework, and then we're going to hear about some specific aspects of that framework. Neil is a professor of evidence-based healthcare in the Department of Health Sciences at Brunel University. He has a long history and research interest focusing on evidence-based management of persistent pain. He was the coordinating editor of the Cochrane Pain and Palliative Care, Pain, Palliative and Supportive Care group from 2020 to 2023, and is a member of their central editorial board. He's also current chair of the IASP Methods, Evidence Synthesis, Implementation Special Interest Group, and has been the scientific coordinator for this project. So I shall hand over to Neil.
Thank you, Roger. And just to check, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, thank you.
That's great. Thank you. Thanks, Roger, for that introduction. Hello, everyone. As Roger said, I'm Neil O'Connell, and I'm going to talk to you about the ENTRUST-PE framework, the project, why we need it, and what perhaps it means. So just going to advance my slide. I should start with a declaration of interest. As Roger said, I'm employed full-time as a professor at Brunel University, London. I have been closely involved with Cochrane for many years now in an editorial role, as well as a Cochrane reviewer. And I was a scientific coordinator of this ENTRUST-PE project, which was funded by the European Research Agency Neuron Co-Fund. So I want to start with some good news, because when we start talking about trust and quality in research, it's easy to get wrapped up in some of our challenges and problems, and we're going to face some of those now. But I think we should start with some good news, which is, and you will be aware of this yourselves, that we are blessed with some fantastic, groundbreaking, rigorous, high quality, transparent research in pain that really has the ability to inform and guide practice and improve patient care. And I'm pretty sure if I asked you now to stop and think about examples of that, you'd be able to come up with a choice example of some high quality research. So I just want you to hold that in mind as we start going into perhaps some of the darker side of the research ecosystem and community in this talk. What do we mean when we even talk about trustworthiness? Well, I went to Professor Google on this one, and Professor Google defines trust as the ability to be relied on as honest or truthful. And they give this example, and if you can just ignore the unfortunate gendered nature of the example, because that's Google's, not mine, he has to prove his trustworthiness to you. And just thinking on that for a second, because I think it's quite telling, kind of speaks to the idea that there is a burden of proof on research to show that it is trustworthy, that we shouldn't have to take the trustworthiness of a piece of research as an article of faith, as an act of faith. And when we traditionally think about the trustworthiness of research, we normally go straight to thinking about, well, what was the methodological rigor in that research, and how transparent is the information that allows me to evaluate that methodological rigor? Any of you who have been involved with systematic reviews or have used systematic reviews will know that we routinely assess the methodological rigor, the risk of bias of studies when we're trying to evaluate the strength of a body of evidence. And it's true that methodological rigor is one piece of this pie that is trustworthiness. And I want to just give you a slightly inflammatory but historic quote from Professor Doug Altman, who is a professor at University of Oxford. He wrote this rather provocative editorial in the BMJ back in 1994 called "The Scandal of Poor Medical Research." And I just want to pluck out one quote from that. What should we think about researchers who use the wrong techniques, use the right techniques wrongly, misinterpret their results, report their results selectively, cite the literature selectively, and draw unjustified conclusions? We should be appalled, and yet numerous studies have shown that all of the above phenomena are common, and this is surely a scandal. We need less research, better research, and research done for the right reasons. Now, Doug said that in 1994. I wonder if we think about how do things look in the world of pain now, how much we've moved on from some of those challenges. And there's a really nice example. Well, I say a nice example, it's quite a challenging example from the field of cannabinoids research. Many of you will be aware that the International Association for the Study of Pain put together a task force to look at the evidence for cannabinoids for pain. And they did a suite of evidence synthesis projects. I just want to talk you through them very quickly. This first systematic review was looking at the preclinical research from animal models about the effects of cannabinoids and cannabis-based medicines. They identified 374 studies, and the reporting of methodological quality across those studies was low enough that all studies were rated at unclear risk of bias. Now just take a moment to pause and think, well, what does that mean for our ability to evaluate whether we should trust this evidence or not? They also did an overview of systematic reviews of cannabinoids for pain. And importantly, they thought this would be the most efficient way to do it. We'll take the published systematic reviews in this space, we'll put them together, we'll see what the answer is. They found 57 systematic reviews. When they rated them using the AmStar2 quality tool, critically low or low confidence was the judgment in 86% of included reviews. And at the end of that laborious process, they concluded that current reviews are mostly lacking in quality and cannot provide a basis for decision making. On that basis, they knew they had to do a high quality systematic review. And so they undertook a de novo systematic review of the original trials. That review identified 36 RCTs that together had randomized 7,217 participants. All had a high or unclear risk of bias. All provided low or very low certainty evidence. And they concluded that the evidence neither supports nor refutes claims of efficacy and safety for cannabinoids, cannabis, or CBM in the management of pain. Now, I would say this is a great example across the research pipeline, from the lab to clinically focused research, of research waste, avoidable biases, poor methodological rigor, bad reporting, meaning that this evidence isn't really in a position to inform practice. But methodological rigor isn't the only challenge that faces us when we're considering trust. Let's talk through some of the others. Beyond how you design and report a study, there are lots of behaviors that researchers can engage with, particularly if they're very motivated to a specific answer, that can bring us to the wrong answer. We call those questionable research practices. So they might be things like selective reporting of only results that support a specific narrative. They might be the use of multiple statistical techniques without testing and correction for that, or the selection of only the statistical technique that gives you the answer that you want. We call that p-hacking, the idea that if you torture the data hard enough, it'll confess to anything. There's all lots of steps in a research project that basically afford researchers degrees of freedom to move the results more likely to the answer that they would want. And these things are quite common in pain research and in health research more broadly. There's also this question of, well, who should trust pain research? Trustworthy to who? Now, we know in health research broadly, and it manifests itself in pain research too, that there is a major problem of underrepresentation of specific groups of society. And yet we try, or I hope we aspire, to produce research with and for everyone in society. So, for instance, we see in research underrepresentation of certain groups on the basis of ethnicity or racialized status. We see the systematic underrepresentation of women in many, many clinical studies, both observational and experimental. We see the exclusion of elderly people and people with comorbidities. We see underrepresentation in the body of research from entire global regions. And even in preclinical research, the preclinical research in pain is dominated by adolescent male rats from a very specific genetic strain. Now, that's remarkable for a condition that disproportionately affects women and burdens women. But there's also this sense of the communities that get to do the research are often excluded as well, both in terms of who gets to be part of the research community and have successful research careers, but also in terms of how we engage with communities to prioritize specific research questions, how we involve communities in our research, how we engage with diverse patient and public involvement, and how we report our research. So inclusion is part of the picture, but so often the detail in research reporting around groups that are characterized in this way is so lacking that we couldn't actually use the data to help better understand and better address disparities in the evidence base and in patient care. Think about the last research paper that you picked up and read, and you looked at the results section. What information did you actually have access to? Usually we have access to groups of summary statistics that the researchers have summarized in the paper. We rarely have access to the full story about that picture. What was planned in terms of a detailed protocol? What materials were used in order to gather the data and analyze the data? Can we actually see the data in its totality? Is that information accessible? The open science movement is really driving us towards improvement in that, but we don't have great engagement in the pain space with open research practices. And so we're excluded from information, and that forces into a position of having to take researchers on trust. We also have an issue in the pain field of narrative bias. Again, all of these things aren't specific to the pain field. They're writ large in health research more broadly, but we know we also see them in the pain field. Spin and narrative bias is common, where we see researchers selectively presenting their results in such a way to spin a certain narrative. And Emma will talk about that in her talk later. And that brings us on to the darkest of these challenges, which is research misconduct. And by research misconduct, I mean the willful falsification, fabrication, or manipulation of research findings, and also fraud in the process of authoring or publishing research. Just to give you an example of, well, there's some sort of reflection on what is the scale of this problem. There's a fantastic review of surveys of scientists by Daniele Fanelli from a few years ago. When he asked researchers, when surveyors ask researchers whether they've ever engaged in questionable research practices, about a third will admit to having done that at some point in time. When you ask researchers if they've ever fabricated, falsified, or modified their data, 2% of researchers would admit to that. When you ask researchers about their colleagues, then it gets interesting. 72% of researchers will say they've seen their colleagues engage with questionable research practice. 14% will say they've seen a colleague engage in falsification, fabrication, and modification. Now, given the social pressure biases on these surveys, we have to assume that's an underestimate. We can get a sense of the scale of it from one angle in the world of pain, at least in terms of misconduct that has been spotted and addressed, which will only be a small fraction of probably the big picture. This is a review that we published in Pain last year, led by a doctoral researcher in the University of New South Wales, Michael Ferraro. And we basically reviewed every paper in the world of pain science broadly that we could identify as having been retracted from the literature. We found that the rate of retractions is growing over time. That's not surprising because the volume of publications is growing over time. But between 1996 and 2022, 389 retracted pain articles. So articles had been retracted. When we looked at the reasons for retraction, 66% of those articles were retracted for reasons related to research misconduct. And again, that is almost certainly an underestimation, because if someone raises a concern about a fraudulent article, the author can say, I made an error, and then retract it themselves. And that would be classified as error, even though it probably represented misconduct. The scale of this problem is likely to get bigger because we have the phenomenon of paper mills, which are shadowy commercial organizations that will sell you authorship for money on what is normally a manufactured paper. We have predatory journals now, the open access predatory journals that will basically give you the illusion of a publishing process, but really fail at those basic qualities of editorial governance. And that just increases the amount of pollution that we see in the literature. And of course, the rise and emergence of generative AI makes all of this really possible super efficiently at an industrial scale. And this is just an example where, playing around with ChatGPT, I wanted to see if it would be prepared to fabricate data. And it sort of reluctantly had a go at it. So you can see that there are lots of sources of potential pollution in our evidence base, plastic in our ocean that reduce the trustworthiness of our research. And I want to just move on to the next bit with this quote from Richard Smith, who used to be the editor of the BMJ. It's a kind of provocative quote again, but he basically makes the point that maybe it's time to move from assuming that research has been honestly conducted and reporting to assuming it to be untrustworthy unless there is evidence to the contrary. And that brings me on to the ENTRUST-PE project. This is a project that was funded by the ERA-NET NEURON co-fund. And our mission was to create a network, an international network of experts in pain research to develop an integrated framework for enhancing and facilitating the trustworthiness of evidence for chronic pain. Here is our network, and what I hope you can see, you'll recognize some names on there, but we have people from across the world. We have people from Australia, the States, Europe. We have people from the preclinical space, all the way through the different disciplines: psychology, pharmacology, medicine, neurology, rehabilitation. We have some senior editors of the pain journals as well. We also have experts in spotting fraudulent data and experts in the editorial process too. And we met across the last year on a number of occasions, including a 2-day meeting at Brunel, to try and sort of better understand the challenges of trustworthy evidence, or the challenges to trustworthy evidence, and also to develop a framework to try and move us towards more trustworthy evidence. Given what I've already said today, you'll be unsurprised that the challenges that we identified were incomplete governance and failures of research integrity, from ethical failures to conflicts of interest to bad data management, inadequate stakeholder involvement and inequitable and non-inclusive research, poor methodological rigor and transparency, a lack of data transparency and accessibility, miscommunication of research results, and of course, research misconduct. And I just want to outline the framework as we see it. We think that really you have to start thinking about trustworthiness from a values-based perspective. And in our basic model, we summarize 7 core values really that would produce trustworthy research. First is that research should be done within a culture of integrity and truth-seeking, and not on the basis of motivation or other interests. Research should be done with good governance, so good ethics, good patient protection, excellent data management, all very transparent information about conflicts of interest and external relationships, all the things that make us be able to trust a process. We also think that we need to review, develop, and really rigorously enforce policies that drive those factors forward. And those integrity and governance sort of values encapsulate everything that comes next. The next core value is equity, diversity, and inclusivity. That means inclusivity in terms of who gets to be involved in research, both in terms of PPIE, but also in terms of getting inclusive, fair research career structures. Then it's about making research accessible to participants from across all communities. It's about working with communities to make that happen. It's about reporting research in such a way that data can serve all communities. Patient and public involvement and engagement. And again, we're talking about really engaging the patient voice in terms of the prioritization of research, in how we form our questions, in how we develop our methods, in how we conduct our studies, and in how we communicate and disseminate that information. And we propose that partnership throughout the process will really improve how much patients and the public can trust our research because they're more invested in it, as well as bringing really valuable perspectives to the research process. You will be completely unsurprised that methodological rigor is in here, that we want to choose methods that are appropriate, minimize bias, that match the question, and then we want to deliver them at a high quality. Openness and transparency of the whole process of research is something that we think underpins more trustworthiness. Balanced communication, and Emma's going to talk about that in her talk. And data authenticity, the idea that we're aware that research misconduct can take place and is likely present in our literature, that we're alert to it, vigilant to it, and act upon it to remove it from the literature. We also recognize that researchers actually operate in a really complex ecosystem. Researchers work within certain cultures, within the culture of their lab, within the culture of their collaborators, within the culture of their discipline, of pain research more broadly, of their institution, and the broader culture too. So peers, leaders and mentors, institutions, funders, regulators, policymakers, reviewers, editors and publishers, consumers of research and people with pain all variably have power and influence and could both positively incentivize good behaviors, but also disincentivize good behaviors. The other part of this is every researcher at some point in their career is more than one of these things. And the point that we make there is all stakeholders in this environment need to work to promote and support and reward good practice, but also the individual researcher in all of their roles needs to model these values and develop and promote and show that good practice too. So if we go back to the framework now, this is just a different visualization of the core values. Those values drive actions and behaviors, which you can see on the slide here, that we think if people acted on them consistently would really enhance the trustworthiness of pain evidence. But importantly, there are a whole range of stakeholders, all who hold some power and all who can make practical actions to incentivize and support and reward better behaviors and more trustworthy research. We've also curated a whole range of resources from outside our project to help people to engage with those things: ED&I, PPIE, methodological rigor, openness and transparency, so that in the resources that we're publishing with this project, people will be able to see lots of external resources that can help them to achieve these values. And just as an example of some of the materials we've produced, it's quite a busy slide, but when you see it off of a slide, you'll see the value potentially. That if you consider the journey of a research project from inception to publication, we've given you some examples of how the core values could be enacted across that process, but also how different stakeholders can have a role in ensuring that we end up with more trustworthy evidence. All of this is summarized in great detail in this white paper, and this QR code here will take you to that white paper. It's completely free to download from the Open Science Framework now. I encourage you to download it, use it, put it into everyone's hands. It is quite a long document. It's a great read, but we have also created a bunch of shorter, more accessible documents, including an executive summary, a summary for editors and publishers, funders, institutions, policymakers, regulators, researchers, peer reviewers, patients and the public, and we'll be making all of those freely available within the next few weeks on a website which we hope to go live in the next 2 weeks as well. So I'm just going to sum up because I've run slightly over. Much of what makes evidence trustworthy is frequently either assumed or taken as an act of faith, but the trustworthiness of research is complex and multidimensional. We hope that ENTRUST-PE offers a framework to guide practice and reporting to enhance the trustworthiness of research for everyone. But to achieve meaningful change is going to require systems-based, but also community-level action, which means action from people like you watching this webinar. I'm sorry I've run slightly over. Thank you very much for listening. Just to acknowledge the ENTRUST Network team, our funders, of ERA-NET and the Federal Ministry of Education in Germany. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Neil, for that introduction and background to the project, and also the key components of the ENTRUST-PE project. We're now going to have, we've got two other speakers who are going to deal with different aspects of the framework, and it gives me great pleasure to introduce our second speaker, Nadia Soliman, who is going to talk about methodological rigor and transparency and openness. Nadia is a research fellow at Imperial College London. Her research focuses on the development and use of evidence synthesis methods for translation between preclinical and clinical chronic pain research. This includes developing, operationalizing and validating automation technologies to improve the feasibility, efficiency, and accuracy of systematic reviews. She is the UK Reproducibility Network local network lead at Imperial and is a proponent of open research practices. So,
thanks, Roger. My camera is not working.
Okay, sorry about that technology.
Yes, I'm very sorry. I'll keep it on in the chance that it does come on, but I'm not sure that it will.
Thank you. But so if you can share your slides.
Yes.
Marvelous.
Brilliant.
So over to you, Nadia.
Thank you. It's great to be here this evening to talk about the ENTRUST-PE framework. And as Roger said, I'll be focusing on methodological rigour and openness and transparency. And this will predominantly be applied to the researcher level, whether that's an individual researcher or research teams. And while Neil sort of highlighted quite a lot of like the common areas in which perhaps research is not trustworthy, I will highlight them again, but with a view for us to identify the ways in which we can demonstrate trustworthiness. But of course, as Neil already sort of highlighted, as researchers, we're not working in a vacuum. And so it's important to consider our context. And a question that I often ask myself is whether our incentives value methodological rigour. And when you think about the part of a study that should remain beyond a researcher's control, it is the results. But then when we think about how we progress through our careers, in many instances, what has the greatest impact on a researcher's career is the results. So there's clearly a tension within our rewards and incentive structures between what is best for science, high quality research regardless of the results, versus what is best for researchers, which can often be described as something that's novel, exciting, positive results. Things are definitely changing. We're definitely seeing a move away from that. But I'd still say there can be a publish or perish culture, and researchers will feel incentivized to exploit the degrees of freedom that they have in terms of the study design, its conduct, analysis, and reporting in order to obtain, let's say, more favorable publishable outcomes. And this, of course, undermines the integrity of research. We do not know whether we can then trust and have confidence in the reported results, undermining trust. And I'm sure that everybody who is a researcher is committed to their research being used for positive impact for the communities that we serve. So ENTRUST-PE has taken a systems-wide approach to provide guidance for how we can uphold the values of methodological rigour and openness and transparency to improve brain research. And throughout the framework, we make recommendations. So the recommendations for institutions around these two values is to provide meaningful training to promote the values of research integrity, to offer sustainable training and infrastructure support for open research practices for research staff at all career levels, and to invest in developing a methodological and statistical expertise in academic staff. So if we have a look across the research pipeline, I've selected elements to highlight some of those common areas that we could all improve in. I encourage you to have a read of the framework because it's far more comprehensive than I have time for today, but we will go through each of these now. So biased literature. There are several concerns around biased literature informing our ideas and our hypotheses. It's a failure to build on the complete total body of previous research, selecting citations. There's plenty of research to show that we often go to the people who we know, to the groups that we know are working in a space. And we actually don't do systematic searches to identify all the research that has been conducted in relation to a specific research question. With that, then it leads to potentially wasted resources, confirmation bias, and incorrect conclusions being drawn. So I appreciate that making your literature review systematic can sound daunting, but there is plenty of guidance out there for how you can conduct this, both for clinical and preclinical research, and there is increasingly more software that's there to enable you to do this and to help you as well. And then if we have a look at the next stage of the research pipelines, we've got our idea and we've got our hypothesis that we may wish to test, or maybe it's just exploratory, but we need to start designing a study and we need to go into data collection. And there are concerns that we can see from different types of systematic reviews around the quality of the study design, around the statistical analysis plans, statistical power, and the failure within experiments to control for biases. So the first bit of advice really around that is considering getting methods guidance. And again, there's a lot out there for different types of research. So for example, the Enhancing Quality in Preclinical Data QUIP framework, it promotes aspects of good scientific practice. None of this is revolutionary, but it does really apply it to preclinical research and promotes aspects of saying whether your research is hypothesis generating, so exploratory or confirmatory, having a clear plan for how you're going to conduct your research, including the analysis plan, and making sure that you use blinding and randomization as means of mitigating experimental bias. The Progress framework gives guidance for the design of prognostic research. In clinical trials, we have IMPACT, which is the initiative on methods, measurement, and pain assessment. We also have ACTION, which is the analgesic, anesthetic, and addiction clinical trial translations, innovations, opportunities, and networks. And they both offer a range of guidance and resources on the development of high-quality pain trials. And when we start looking at systematic reviews, the Cochrane Handbook is definitely the best trusted guide out there. I Google it most days to answer questions, but also in relation to that, whilst it is, of course, clinical, if you're looking to do preclinical systematic review, the Camarades group have adapted the Cochrane Handbook for preclinical research. And there are many more different methods guidance available. So the next part of the research pipeline to highlight is once we've collected data, what happens then? And I like this little quip that I've got on the slide here, that a reader, quick, keen, and leery, did wonder, ponder, and query. From results clean and tight, fit predictions just right, if the data preceded the theory. So a lot of the concerns is that actually researchers have a lot of freedom around their analyses, and they are incentivized to exploit these degrees of freedom in their analyses. And that leads to problems of multiple testing and selective reporting. So on the slide here, this paper actually gives us a really good comprehensive overview of p-hacking. And this is where you do as many tests as you possibly can, essentially, to find a significant result. Get that below that 0.05, and you're laughing your way up the career ladder, is some people's views on what they could be doing. Of course, it's not just like that, and it's a lot more complex. And one of the hardest things about it is that it's very difficult to detect. And p-hacking really is about that exploitation of undisclosed analytical flexibility in scientific data analysis. And the examples on the slide shows the difference here I've chosen around favourable imputation. And I think this is something that we see quite regularly in pain clinical trials, is whether researchers use the last outcome carried forward or the baseline outcome carried forward. There are limitations to all of our analyses when there is missing data, but you can see that the assumption, if you take the baseline outcome carried forward versus the last outcome carried forwards, are very different in terms of what the pain score will be. And we need to be able to discern what has happened within a study and why it has happened. So once researchers have found their significant results, they can formulate or modify the hypothesis and make it appear as though they had predicted it before data collection. And that's called harking, hypothesizing after the results are known. They because hypotheses are then generated based on data that has already been observed, there then is this increased risk of finding patterns that aren't actually there. They're just they're not necessarily, they're just there due to chance, not actually reflecting a true effect. And if other researchers then try to replicate the study under the impression that those results were predicted, they may well not achieve the same outcomes. So hypotheses should ideally be formed based on theory, certainly prior to there being any data collection, and they need to be tested objectively through the data collection and analysed objectively. And as we've now done our analysis, we come to the writing up, and this is where selective reporting starts to come in. So a note on outcome switching. So I've got here on this first point is switching primary and secondary outcomes. In preclinical studies, this would be almost near impossible to identify because most researchers do not plan or report whether their research is exploratory or confirmatory, let alone what the primary outcome was. We also would see in selective reporting only reporting positive effects, or we'll see results being described as significant when they're not. We also know that lots of studies will exclude results from publication, cherry picking what they want to present, and that we also have a lack of detail and transparency. Often things are not described in adequate detail, particularly with regards to any missing data or lost samples. As somebody who's done a lot of preclinical systematic reviews, I often ask myself, what happened to all these animals? Why can't I count them? There's a lot that we're missing from the, let's say, our published evidence base. So what can we do to improve trustworthiness of research? And I'd like you to think back to Neil's point right at the beginning about and be cognizant that the burden of proof probably sits with us as researchers. And increasingly now we're operating in an environment where there are more threats to the trustworthiness of research. There are actually nefarious actors that are trying to undermine research endeavour, undermine public trust and confidence. We saw that throughout the height of the COVID pandemic. There's also the use of AI that's leading to more prolific paper mill activity, which is just the publishing of studies that haven't ever been conducted. We also know that researchers may choose to use AI in this way. And so for those of us who are trying to do the best that we can, honest and rigorous research, we need to think about how do we delineate ourselves from what's happening around us. So the first step is pre-registration and registered reports. So this is whereby you write up your research protocol and analysis plan before any data have been collected and upload it to a repository. For systematic reviews, there's the Prospero repository. For preclinical studies, you could use Clinical Trials EU, but for everything you can use the Open Science Framework. And what's important is that you'll have a time date stamp, it's publicly accessible, and in this you can plan everything in as much detail as possible. And of course things may not go to plan, but that's okay, you can always explain that later. But in it you also may wish to not only have a very rigorous methodological protocol and statistical analysis plan, but think about other elements of trustworthiness like openness and transparency. For example, getting the ethical advice and approvals in place so you can make things as open and transparent as possible. On the point of registered reports, this is where a journal accepts a study in advance based on the quality of the study design and the quality of the statistical analysis plan. And that removes the incentives from authors to change what they're doing. And it also removes the incentives for publishers to ensure that actually what they do publish is based on high quality research, not on the results. Unfortunately, and I think it's still the case to date, that no pain specific journals offer registered reports, but there are plenty of other journals that we would look to potentially publish in that do. And the thing about pre-registration is you might be thinking, well, that's a lot of work. You shouldn't be thinking that, because actually it's just good scientific practice to have those rigorous plans in place before we start it. But what we have seen is that it actually makes null findings visible. So 153 registered reports with 143 comparable traditional results. And you can see on this graph just quite the size of difference, going from, you know, the between 10 and 20% up over 60%. So we know that publication bias is distorting the literature, i.e. publishing positive results is distorting the literature, and that's impacting how reliable our theories and hypotheses are, and how reliable the evidence base is that we are trying to build up from. So, you know, it's concerning to think about the foundations and how shaky they may be. Another effect of pre-registration is that it shrinks effect sizes. So with pre-registration is what you can see in green, and you can see the frequency of the sizes of the effects, and they are much larger, much smaller than what you can see without pre-registration. And so for researchers to demonstrate the trustworthiness of their research, it does require transparency, both of the processes or the methods and of the data. And transparency of processes allows us to know the information about what was planned, what happened, what decisions you made as a researcher, you know, what freedoms did you exercise, and where in the research process. And then actually be able to see the data at the end to have a comprehensive understanding of everything that went on. So how do we do that? So one of the first things is to understand that research needs to be included and used in evidence synthesis. And the only way for an intervention to be adopted into practice by policymakers is if they are confident on the quality of the evidence. So reporting inadequately would delay anything being brought into practice, and could have a really negative impact in terms of what we're trying to achieve in service to our communities. There is no difference in a poor study quality or high study quality if there aren't reporting guidelines that have been filled out correctly. And so I would encourage you to check the Equator Network for the guidelines that are relevant to the type of research that you're doing. They are very comprehensive for Consort for clinical trials. We've got ARRIVE guidelines for preclinical trials. We've got PRISMA guidelines for systematic reviews. There are many different guidelines for many different types of research, and for actually components of the research as well. For example, patient partner inclusion. So go and have a look there at the next time that you're writing up to ensure that you include all the relevant information and report completely. And then sharing data allows others to check our work. And it can also offer others the opportunity to reuse the data and build up upon it. And that would further our research interests. It's really important that data is fair, and there are loads of resources out there that can help support you to make sure that it is findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. And this study that I've got on the screen here, it shows, interestingly, that articles that shared data, made their data publicly available, were cited much more than articles that didn't. Along the bottom here, there are a number of repositories that you could look to share your data in, and many institutions now are creating their own repositories as well. Of course, there are concerns around the ethical sharing of data, particularly if it's sensitive data. Seek guidance from your ethics committees, because a lot of data can be shared. It's just how it is shared. There's a phrase that's often used, which is close as necessary, open as possible. So if you take that forward, get advice from those who know how, and actually you'll be able to make a lot more of your research open, and that will build greater trust around it. And with that, there's something about making all of our outputs open. We want to increase visibility. We want to increase our research reach as researchers. We want to increase our readership. And of course, we want to increase our citations. It's one part of the ways in which we can demonstrate impact. And speed in which we get out our research may also be an important factor. So on the slide here, I've got a number of different types of journal options, gold open access being very expensive, particularly for a lot of journals, and obviously not all of us would have funding to support that. But then there are alternatives like green open access, which should be sharing it within an institutional policy, within an institutional repository. And we can also make some of our early versions available on preprint servers. In doing this, it just means that more people have access to our work, more people can engage with the research that we're doing. And while this slide is very much focused on publication, which is, of course, a very traditional research output, we can also consider making different types of outputs open, whether that's videos or fact sheets, using Substack and writing blogs. There are many different ways of disseminating research, but that research needs to be underpinned by all the good scientific practices that we've just talked about. So lastly, when we think about at the end of the research pipeline, we're coming up to publication and the peer review process. So we're submitting to a journal. And I think at this point, we need to consider our publication outlet. Open and transparent reporting in journals that value all results is really key. They shouldn't be selecting articles based on whether the results are null, negative, or positive, and they should be judging by the methodological quality, and this will prevent publication bias. And ENTRUST-PE recommends that editors, publishers, peer reviewers, so we all wear these hats, as certainly as most researchers will definitely be peer reviewers, is that we prioritize methodological rigor and transparency as an important indicator in funding, reviewing, and editorial decisions. And we ask for authors to report research according to established reporting guidelines and checklists at the point of submission, and that we carefully audit that. So pre-register, share data, share materials have many benefits. For researchers, it increases visibility, increases recognition, increases the rigor and transparency in our work. For science, improved transparency of research means that it can be more easily verified. It can be brought into policy or practice in a much more efficient way. We can ensure that research is conducted, that has been conducted, can be reproduced, and that our practices are sustainable. And for society, that means that they can readily gain access to and use trustworthy scientific information. And so I will finish up with this. I think some of these things can be overwhelming if you haven't done them before. It's better to think of open science practices as a bit of a smorgasbord and just choose the next time in the next research project. What can you do to improve the methodological rigor, openness, and transparency? And if you'd like to take a moment just to think about that and make a commitment to yourself now. Thank you.
Thank you, Nadia. Just as a reminder, if you have any questions or comments, if you would place them in the Q&A, you're using the Q&A button at the bottom of the Zoom screen. We're now going to consider two other components of the ENTRUST-PE framework, and it gives me great pleasure to introduce Emma Fisher, who is a Senior Research Fellow at the University of Bath. Her primary research interests focus on risk factors for developing chronic pain after an acute musculoskeletal injury in children and adolescents. But she's also interested in blast trauma in children, evidence-based medicine, quality and trustworthiness of pain science. Other interests include mechanisms in pain transition, menstrual pain, and virtual reality. And Emma is going to talk to us this evening about balanced communication and data authenticity.
All right, thank you. Thanks, Roger. Okie dokie. Here we go. Thanks so much for having me. As Roger has very nicely introduced me, I am going to be talking about balanced communication and data authenticity. So I don't have any disclosures. And I know that Nadia showed the screen and Neil has showed it as well, but just to kind of focus your attention as to where I'm looking at the ENTRUST-PE model today. I'm looking in this bottom left-hand corner around data authenticity and balanced communication. And I'm going to start with balanced communication, which I'll often refer to as narrative bias in this talk. And it's always good to start off with a definition. So narrative bias was defined by Boutron as the specific reporting strategies from whatever motive to highlight that an experimental treatment is beneficial, despite a statistically non-significant difference for the primary outcome, or to distract the reader from a statistically non-significant result. And whilst I agree with that, I also think that you could flip it. So it's whatever the motive is that the author is trying to take you towards. So that might be a non-significant finding. It doesn't always have to be a significant finding. Andrew Moore in 2024 on a paper that I was also involved in, and I'm going to talk a little bit about today, we defined it as a tendency to interpret information as part of a larger story or pattern, regardless of whether the facts support the full narrative. So we took a bit of a broader view of narrative bias. And given the prolific increase in systematic reviews and meta-analyses and randomized controlled trials, we know that not all research can be trusted, and not all research is good. And I think that often we use shortcuts such as a good impact factor of a journal or authors that we might recognize. But I think that it's important to realize that often academics are salespeople. We're trying to sell our findings to the peer reviewer, to the editor, to the policymaker, or to the funder. And so we are often trying to sell our research and make it be seen in the most positive light. And sometimes we need to just go back and check ourselves to make sure that we're being fully transparent about and giving it a very balanced narrative around our research as well. And you know, we see spin all the time in the media, in our tabloids, and we're very familiar with that, and we're often quite critical towards it. And I would encourage you to be as critical as you are towards the Daily Mail stories, as you can be towards the science that you're reading as well. And here's quite a nice example of where narrative bias can really take you somewhere different. So you probably won't have time to read this full abstract, but if you only read the bold parts of this abstract, then it says that if you listen to When I'm 64, you become about a year and a half younger. And we know that that simply can't be correct, but unless you read the full detail of what they controlled for and what this study did, then they are the conclusions that you could come to. So it's really important that we are fully transparent. We do say everything that we need to say throughout all of our research. So narrative bias questions, this is taken from a tool that we developed and was published this year in the Journal of Pain. And we operationalize narrative bias into 6 different questions and then 1 overall narrative bias rating. So we considered title overreach, whether the title extended beyond the study methods and findings to judgment, opinion, or narrative. Switching, which Nadia's briefly touched on. So whether the abstract failed to present the outcomes in the order in which they appear in the study registration, and if there isn't one of those, then in the method, because quite often you'll see people presenting their significant finding first, regardless of whether it's their primary outcome or not. Selective reporting, so whether the abstract presented outcomes selectively. Quite often we only see significant findings in abstracts rather than non-significant findings. Promoting the null, so whether non-significant results are described as promising or marginal. The singularization rhetoric, so does the abstract include the results in a single direction without acknowledging the complexity or quality of the findings that they might have found elsewhere in the paper. And then a safety claim. So this is often applied to trials or systematic reviews, so evidence of no greater risk of 1 in 1,000. And these different items can be applied to any, certainly any RCT or systematic review, and you answer it either yes or no, and then you come out with a rating at the end. The bottom one is just an overall bias rating based on the rater's judgment from 0 to 3. So we applied this tool to a range of RCTs and systematic reviews done in cannabis, cannabinoids, and cannabis-based medicines. We didn't do this deliberately because we think that this field has a particular problem, but we had an up-to-date literature in this area when the tool was developed. We are now starting to apply it to psychological trials, and we think that we'll probably see something similar in psychological and pharmacological trials as we do for cannabis-based products. But what we found is that 24% of RCTs and 17% of systematic reviews had moderate or severe narrative bias using the tool that I just showed you. And all of that narrative bias was in the direction of the support for the product. So that just shows you that narrative bias is quite prolific amongst science, particularly in cannabis, but also we would strongly suggest that it is in other areas as well. And we also wondered whether there was a kind of a default as to where narrative bias might occur. So did it happen in poorer quality studies using some quality indicators which are quite well established? So year of publication, you could argue that more recent science is higher quality because we're trying to adhere to higher standards, whether the paper reported statistical significance, whether they were judged as high risk of bias. Anyway, so we looked at all of these different things in the narrative bias scores, and we found no statistical associations between any of these variables and the narrative bias score. So it does seem to be a standalone thing. So you might have a paper published in the best journal, most recently funded, not by industry, pre-registered primary outcomes, and it might still have a degree or quite a lot of narrative bias within it. And so going back to the ENTRUST framework, there's the core value that research should be communicated with balance and without narrative bias. And universal actions and behaviours are that we should be reporting all planned results regardless of the findings, and to make clear the distinction between exploratory and confirmatory research, as Nadia was highlighting earlier. Excuse me. And to make clear the distinction between reasonable interpretation of the data and of speculation. So next, I'm going to talk about data authenticity. I'm going to slow down a bit because I went through that last part quite speedily. I was a bit worried about time, but I think I've made up a little bit. So data authenticity, this isn't necessarily an area that I would consider myself expert in. Normally we have Jack Wilkinson, who's a wonderful researcher, presenting on this. But I was involved in some of the trustworthy work that sprung the ENTRUST framework. So trust that research published is, we always trust that the research that's published is trustworthy, and then we generally apply tools to assess the quality of that research. Sorry, just 1 second, I've got a cough. Sorry, always bad timing. But I think that we probably need to take a step back and consider that not all research is trustworthy, and we need to understand that research is trustworthy before we then go and apply these quality tools. And we can talk for probably quite a long time around the motivations in which there are to falsify data. There's some research that's been published around where most false data is published geographically and at the stages of career and in various fields as well. But I think that's probably a different talk. So in the top right-hand corner, there's fraud goes from unintentional to intentional. And I can't see my slide up here. But from errors through to fabrication and falsification. And it can, you know, the top left-hand side, typographical errors or analytical errors, you know, human errors are likely to happen within research and are very, very forgivable. But as you move towards the bottom right-hand area around falsification and fabrication and plagiarism, they're certainly intentional behaviours and they should be retracted from the database. And when there's been a survey that's been done around questionable research practices or modifying, falsifying or fabricated data, when people are asked to report on their own behaviour, we see a lot less of those types of behaviours being self-disclosed, which is not really that surprising. But when they're asked to report on other people's behaviour, you see a lot more of those types of behaviours around modifying or falsifying and fabricating data, which is the orange on this little pie chart, and using questionable research practices. So these behaviours are somewhat prolific within the field. And again, this is another kind of reason why we should maybe start from a position that not all research is trustworthy until it's proven so. Now, I came into this area because I published a systematic review led by Amanda Williams a few years ago that looked at psychological therapies versus any control, in this case, active control, for people with chronic pain. And during the search and the update of that Cochrane review, we found 3 studies by Monteconi that had effect sizes that were just way beyond the rest of the field, and were really quite surprising and somewhat encouraging. And so we contacted Monteconi and asked him what he was doing that was so brilliant. And he came back to us with some not particularly convincing responses as to why his treatment was so much better than anyone else's. And so in the main analysis of this Cochrane review, we removed those studies. And you can see in the green that there was a small effect, narrow confidence intervals, and low heterogeneity of that meta-analysis. We then included this forest plot that you can see here in the sensitivity analysis, and we found moderate effect, wide confidence intervals, and high heterogeneity when Monteconi was included. So that just kind of piqued our interest as to what was going on and why did Monteconi do so much better than everyone else in the field. And so, led by Neil, we decided to investigate the veracity of a sample of Monteconi's work that he had published. There were 10 trials that we found that he had published in persistent spinal pain, all tested CBT, most included exercise as well, and were compared to exercise alone. Monteconi was the lead author across all 10 studies. And these weren't the only studies that he'd been publishing, or the only RCTs that he'd been publishing within this time. They're all single centre. And that was also quite surprising that he was able to publish so many different RCTs. Now, if you look at the risk of bias plots and you're familiar with risk of bias, you'll see that there's nothing really terribly surprising about those risk of bias plots. In fact, I'd say they look fairly green. There is a strip of red down the middle. That's simply because it's not possible to blind participants and personnel to when they're receiving therapy. But one thing that we considered was how to investigate trustworthiness of these trials, because there's no gold standard approach. And so Neil, and I've stolen his slide here, so thank you, Neil, for this. So we took a multi-pronged approach, which I'm just going to go through very, very briefly with you. So we looked at the trials, and none of the included trials were pre-registered, which was surprising considering that they had been published up to 2021. And I would consider pre-registration pretty standard for RCTs nowadays. There was no confirmation of ethical approval or study conduct. The authors did not share their protocols or the data when we requested them to. The baseline distributions were inconsistent with randomization. I can't see that, but I think that says something along lines of baseline groups are always equal. Hopefully you can see that. I've got the zoom bar across the top. I also can't see that, so apologies for that. Erroneous p-values in baseline tables, so we just found that the p-values just weren't possible given the baseline data. 8 out of 10 studies had extreme effect sizes at all time points and were highly divergent. There was no clear reason for divergence in the intervention content, given the responses that we had with him previously. And there was low to no attrition in some of the studies, which was surprising given previous data in the field and given that some of these trials were quite long, up to 12 months. And given that we investigated those, we found that 8 out of those 10 trials seemed to be untrustworthy. We then wanted to see the downstream effect of what did that untrustworthy research do to the rest of the field. And so using those 8 trials that we found to be untrustworthy, we then did a forward search to see where they had been cited in the literature in terms of systematic reviews and clinical guidelines. And you can see here that we found 32 reviews and 10 clinical guidelines. And within those 42 publications, we found that none raised concerns. When we removed the index trials, so the 8 trials that we found to be untrustworthy, that reduced the effect sizes by a median of 58%, which is huge. And you can see in the bottom right-hand corner here, so the blue is where the untrustworthy trials are included in the effect sizes, or the median standardized mean differences. And then the red is when those trials have been removed. And as you move more across to the right, those lines get slightly bigger. And 9 out of 10 clinical guidelines made positive recommendations for the interventions evaluated. So these untrustworthy trials have skewed the field, and they have skewed clinical guidelines as well. And when we wrote to the journal editors to inform them of our research and to highlight that some of the publications that they might have included in their journals were untrustworthy, we found it a bit of an uphill battle, to be honest. So three editors investigated and then retracted, although that could often be quite a long period of time. One further retracted 2 years later after an independent investigation raised other similar concerns. But we had a different experience with 2 other editors. One just stopped communicating with us, and another accused us of academic intimidation and advocated that the results were likely to be useful for other researchers in the field. Now, it's unclear to me who those other researchers might be and why those results might be useful, but I'm sure that editor has his reasons or her reasons. And we wrote this up, so this is all transparent, and you can find it in the Journal of Clinical Epidemiology. Now, Mark Bolland did something similar. He also investigated an additional 7 trials and also wrote to journal editors, and had a similar experience in that some retracted, but most actually didn't. So one actually said that they were going to retract, but they still haven't over 12 months later. And there's a lot of inaction. So even when trials are found to be untrustworthy, they're not always retracted from the literature. There's a large time delay in that. And so the core recommendations from ENTRUST is that inauthentic data should be identified and excluded. And the universal actions and behaviours are to be vigilant to markers of potential inauthentic data and research misconduct, and call attention to them and take action, and then to commit timely action to remove inauthentic data from literature and correct errors in the published literature. So that's what ENTRUST is recommending, and I'd encourage you to go and read the larger white paper, because there's a lot more information in there. So thank you to Neil and to the ENTRUST team, and then this is our team at Bath CPR. So thank you so much for your time, and hopefully you're all still awake.
Thank you, Emma. And Neil, you came back without me asking. That's very kind of you. Can I just remind you, if you have any questions or comments, if you can post them in the Q&A function, and we will pick them up and discuss them in the panel. We'll probably, depending upon the discussion, we'll see time-wise, but we'll perhaps aim to finish by 8 o'clock. So people have, or you can start planning the rest of your evening. Thank you to Neil, Nadia, and Emma. This is an area I find very fascinating. But Neil, I'd like to take you back to one of your first slides when you included the quote from Doug Altman about the scandal of poor research being highlighted in 1994. Presumably, it's something that's been going on for years and years and years, that we have been unaware of or oblivious to. Why do you think it's taken so long for it to become an area of interest to the research community? And from something I was reading within the last couple of days, it's not just within pain, it's within other therapeutic areas as well. I was reading a obstetrics and gynecology paper that was suggesting one particular researcher had 84 clinical trials ongoing at one time. But it amazes me that after these issues have been raised, it's taken so long for the community to become really engaged in the topic.
That's a great question. I think the problem has grown because research has grown. I think that the marketization of research in higher education, the incentivization of very competitive career structures in academia, the publish and perish culture, these have all been accelerants on a problem. So even though as methods improve and methodological knowledge improves, practice doesn't necessarily follow, because what we value is the output rather than the process. And I don't think it's specific to pain, but I would reflect on, if people think about any pain conference they've been to and they've listened to the presentations, my reflections is we often hear a lot about the answer and the question, but we don't get a lot of detail about the process. And also you don't receive many questions about the process. And as scientists, of course, we should be obsessed with the process and let the results take care of themselves. But I think there are lots of reasons why we don't. Why don't we attend to it very much? Well, it's profoundly uncomfortable to attend to uncomfortable things. And I think it's not particularly a natural human instinct to focus on challenges and to focus on the negative. I also think something about academic culture that makes us celebrate everything, even when perhaps we don't have cause to celebration, sometimes directs us away from attending to those difficult truths as well. And there's a broader issue of governance, in the sense of, if you take, for instance, as a really basic example of governance, we have to apply for research ethics in order to do primary research on humans, and that's absolutely as it should be. No one would contest that. We write our protocols, we write our ethical applications, we finally get approval. Who checks? Auditing of actually what happens is there. It's very piecemeal. I've never really seen any action taken off the back of that in my decades in academia. And so you ask yourself, well, is that a governance system that's fit for purpose? And I think there hasn't been a great deal of investment in structures and governance that really have enough teeth to direct people's behavior. So there's incentives. I think there's the human tendency not to attend to difficult truths, and there's the fact that academics and researchers are on a bit of a treadmill of productivity, which sometimes encourages less than optimal behaviors.
Thanks for a very comprehensive answer. I'm sure Emma or Nadia, have you any thoughts?
Yeah, so to add to what Neil said, I think that a lot of these practices aren't built into our research processes. So when we write our ethics applications, we often have to write data management plans, but I don't think that we're particularly thoughtful. Like, we might say that we want to share our data, but I don't think many of us know how, when, which website, what code to put up, or what's expected of open access requirements. And so that isn't built in at an early stage. And then by the time that you've done your research, you've thought ethics and you've got it, you've then probably struggled to recruit and had to go to plan B, C, or D to be able to recruit your population. You've run your methods, you've done your analysis, which will take a substantial amount of time after you've done all of the due data cleaning, processing, analysis. You've written it up, it's gone around your co-authors 5 or 6 times. You've then gone to peer review 1 or 2 times. You've done your copy edit. You finally got the thing published. Are you really going to go back to the beginning and make that data open access? Because your data is probably a little bit all over the place. You've not named your variables clearly, and just to be very, I find myself guilty of this, and I'm happy to put my hands up, and this is why I'm really interested in this subject, because I want to be a better scientist. But I think that we're not trained well enough in open and transparent research right from the beginning, and that has to be better built into our PhD programs and to our postdocs, so that they're thinking when they start their data analysis, that they've got to be clear with their variables, they've got to be saving their syntax, and they've got to make that data open and online, and they know how to do that. So from personal experience, that's a few of my barriers, and I'm trying to get better at it. As I'm sure Neil said right at the beginning, you know, we are not perfect. We are all on this path of discovery.
I mean, that's absolutely right as well. We're not preaching from a position of purity. We're recognizing and reflecting critically on challenges and trying to offer people support and awareness and solutions to help them along the way. But, you know, we can all improve our practice, quality improvements for everyone, right?
The only thing I would add is that a lot of this requires infrastructure and not just a few infrastructure to support it. If we're talking about sharing data, actually we need to be told where to do that, how people could access it, whether it's secure, is it going to be maintained, is it sustainable, how will other, you know, how can other people interoperate with it. There's a whole question around infrastructure, and we're probably quite behind in terms of where we need to be for the amount of data that's being generated and the types of data that are being generated to really do this well. Now we're kind of chasing our tails a little bit. And then I think in relation to that, it's investment in our training, investment in saying that actually, if this is what we value and this is what we require, then we need investment in it. And I'm not sure that we put the resource and funding into those things. We put our resource and funding into producing, let's say, research that isn't as high quality as it could be, and we don't have the means in which to really verify that.
Thanks, Nadia. Well, one of the things that occurred to me while you were talking, Neil, was around industry-funded studies. Now, I realise that none of you come from areas that are particularly where there are large numbers of industry-funded studies, but certainly within or when sites are selected, I have always been aware of perhaps greater external scrutiny when there are site monitoring visits, and perhaps that is something that is or has been part of the industry culture, but has never sort of then translated into other types of study. But of course, whether industry-funded studies then tend to come with other biases as well.
I mean, I think what that speaks to is about the professionalization of research, and I think the professional level of research is a real continuum. So you've got everything from, you know, very well supported industry funded studies where they'll employ armies of great methodologists, they'll have all that extra oversight and it's all built in. But also, I mean, if you look at, you know, UKRI funded research, NIHR funded trials run with clinical trials unit, again, what you see is a very high level of professionalization. You'll see regular site visits, lots of fidelity work and all of that. But then at the other end of the spectrum, you see a lot, you know, potentially less resource, less skill, less capacity to do that stuff. So there's something about how the research that we do and we publish needs to be adequately resourced. I think the teams that do research need to have adequate expertise and breadth of expertise. One of the things that comes through, I think, quite a lot in the literature on this topic is the lack of statistical and methodological expertise on a lot of published clinical research. And that really is, it is not acceptable to see statistics as an amateur sport in research, because, you know, ultimately it's the statistics that end up generating the answer. And so we really need to professionalize that. So I don't think it's an industry thing. I think it's a professionalization thing. And I think there is a real need, again, for everyone in terms of research to reflect on whether the research team have the skill set to deliver that, whether the methodological skill level and the resources are up to speed. And if not, that team might need expanding. So it's about matching skills to process, I think.
Thanks very much.
Nadia has a hand up, I think.
Yes.
Sorry, it's hard without a camera. When you first started asking the question, Roger, the thing that started to come to mind was also where we may be influenced by industry sponsors. And again, none of us are. But a wider conversation is around declarations and conflicts of interest and whether they're influencing the way in which we've conducted research, the way in which we're reporting research and our research findings. What I have yet to see, and I think it's not entirely true. Cochrane have taken quite a strong stance around what people's interests can be to be able to serve on a Cochrane systematic review. But that's the only place where I've really seen it. Maybe other people will have experience of it. I see everybody saying these are my declarations, but I've never really seen anyone say, well, hold on a minute, what does that mean? And I've not really seen anyone be removed or from a research project or say, well, actually that could be too much of a conflict of interest for you to present on this or for this to be published. So I just ask ourselves, are we managing these different aspects as well as they could be? And what processes could we put in place to do so?
Thank you. Interesting reflections. I'm conscious of time. Equally, that I can't see any questions from the delegates at the moment. So I'm just going to ask one last question to the three of you, unless there are any other questions from the audience. And that really relates to, so having such a framework, how can we start to make a difference? Let's start with you, Neil.
That's a great question. I mean, one of the things that we pick up on in the white paper is that doing all of this, and I think Nadia touched on it in her talk as well, doing all of this could feel overwhelming in one go. And we recognize that each of these things is actually quite potentially intimidating behavior change if it's not routine and you've not done it before. And so what we've done is we've considered amongst the network, what one change could we ask people to make for each of the core values that would help them step on to this and sort of start working with this. So just to take an example from one of the core values, which is openness and transparency. The simplest thing that you could do, and this is not specific to any type of study, it's for across all studies, qualitative, quantitative, trials, observational, preclinical, would be to pre-register a detailed protocol about what you're doing, how you're going to do it, and how you will work with that. Not as a straitjacket, but as a plan. We can deviate from protocols as long as we're transparent about the reasons for that. But that would be a single easy thing to do. It's very accessible on the open science framework. And so, that's not particularly challenging. Another one in terms of PPIE would be to consider right at the start when you're choosing your research question, who is important as a stakeholder in this topic? Can we access people in those communities? Can we ask them about their views on it? Are some of them happy to be engaged in our project? And to start planning and building in some level of engagement so that the project is informed by the people it's supposed to serve. They're two small things, but there's lots of little things. And in the paper, and the executive summary as well, we offer a table for each.
I mean, I think that you've nailed it, Neil. My one thing would be pre-register. If I was going to do anything from this ENTRUST framework, I would pre-register.
Thank you, Emma.
Definitely echo pre-registration. I think it's the one of the easiest things for anyone to do, but probably one of the biggest change levers that we've also got as a community.
And just coming round to Emma's point as well, plan. So if you've got a project that's in that sort of nascent stage of you're thinking about what's it going to be, well, think about each of the values and plan. And if you plan engagement, if you plan to recruit a diverse sample, and think about practically how you can do that. If you plan for sharing stuff, then it's going to be much, much easier for you to demonstrate, signpost and model those values. If you try and do it as you go, it's much more challenging, I think.
Thank you, Neil. I think that's a very nice place to end the webinar. So thank you, Nadia, Emma and Neil for presenting. Thank you to those people who have attended this evening. As has been put in the chat, please do, as a reminder, please do fill in the evaluation form and you will receive a certificate of attendance. And if there are any other questions, having been directed to the white paper and all of the other resources, then please do get in touch and we will try and answer them. Have a good evening. Thank you.
Thank you, Roger.
Thank you.